What is the best unexplained mystery? Serious replies only. The disappearance of Terrence Williams and Felipe Santos. Two men, unrelated, who didn't know each other, disappeared from Naples, Florida 3 months apart under the exact same circumstances. Both men were last spotted being arrested by Deputy Steve Calkins for driving without a license. Neither men were taken to jail. They just disappeared. His story is that he dropped both men off at Circle K convenience stores and drove away. There isn't as much evidence to go on with Santos' disappearance, but his story was actively disputed by the available evidence when it comes to Terrence's disappearance. For instance, he had Terrence's car towed and told the tow operator that the car was abandoned. But there were witnesses who saw him pull over Terrence and arrest him. What did he do with these men? My own theory is that he gave them a starlight ride, in other words, he drove them into the wilderness and dropped them off for them to walk home and they died of exposure, dehydration. To me, it makes the most sense with the evidence. But maybe he's a serial killer, who knows? This is my hometown and literally no one talks about it. Almost everyone knows about it, we just don't talk about it. Everyone knows he definitely killed them though. Most people I've asked about it think he killed them and dumped their bodies in the wilderness, possibly fed them to the gators. Is he still a cop? No. He was initially cleared of wrongdoing after Felipe's disappearance, but after Terrence's disappearance they knew something was very wrong and he was fired. As much corruption as Florida is known to have with their police, it really does seem like they took this case seriously and responded appropriately to it. They did a ton of searches, they covertly put a GPS on his car, did forensic tests on his car, they questioned him and gave his a shit ton of polygraphs. And ultimately fired him. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Long story short, he was driving down a road in Minnesota in 2008 and came off into a ditch. He phoned his father to ask him to pick him up and told him where he was, and his father said he would pick him up at a nearby town called Lind and that Brandon should walk there and meet him. As his parents were on the way to pick him up, they were on the phone to him. They were unable to see him initially, so they asked him to flash his car's lights. Nothing. He said he could see the lights of a nearby town and would walk towards them. His father dropped his mother back at home and went back out to find him. At around 2 a.m., after around 47 minutes on the phone, Brandon yelled, "Oh shit," and the phone hung up. That was the last anyone ever heard from him. His car was found near Taunton, MN, around 20 miles from where he said he was. His phone was never recovered. No trace of him has ever been found. No one knows what the lights he saw were, why he yelled, "Oh shit," why he was 20 miles from where he said he was, where he went or where he is. The death of Gareth Williams really unnerves me for some reason. He was a mathematician who worked for MI6 and went missing in about 2010. When they investigated his apartment, they found a gym bag in the bath, padlocked shut, and his body was curled up inside. There was no evidence that anyone else had been inside the house, and on his computer history there was a bunch of fetish stuff about being locked in small spaces, but they got a bunch of people to try and lock themselves in a bag. Some people tried hundreds of times, and even if they could get the bag closed, none of them could lock it. Nobody knows whether his death was an accident or murder. To me, it's Jack the Ripper, but a lesser-known one was the boy in the box. In February of 1957, a boy around 4 to 6 years old was found beaten and nude in a box outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His picture was spread all around Pennsylvania, and no one has any idea who he is. They even did a fictionalized version of the story on Cold Case. A similar thing happened in my hometown in the 1930s also. Some kid that was only around 7 or 8 years old went swimming with his friends in a secluded swimming hole and disappeared. For a while, it was thought that he drowned and was swept downriver, but he turned up a few weeks later with his throat slashed next to the railroad tracks. Happened almost 90 years ago and it's still unsolved. Edit, his name was Buddy Schumacher. The Bobby Dunbar case. In 1912 a 4-year-old disappeared while his family was camping. After a frantic 8-month search, a child matching his description was found one state over in the company of a traveling tinkerer. This little boy recognized Mr. and Mrs. Dunbar as his parents and seemed to know details of Bobby Dunbar's life. The tinkerer insisted that the child was actually Bruce Anderson, whose mother, a single, illiterate, poor servant, had given him custody because she couldn't afford to raise Bruce. Julia Anderson traveled to Louisiana to support his story and identified the little boy as Bruce. However, the courts believed the Dunbars instead and convicted the tinkerer of kidnapping. He later won an appeal, but the Dunbars retained custody of Bobby. 90 years later, Bobby's granddaughter was doing a genealogy project and discovered the old controversy. She had her father and her uncle, son of the younger subset brother, take a DNA test. The test proved that Bobby Dunbar was not related to the Dunbar family. He was Bruce Anderson all along. So, what happened to Bobby? That's awfully similar to Walter Collins and the Wineville chicken coop murders. Boy goes missing, police return a boy to mother, the mother insists the boy isn't her son, police don't listen but it turns out mom is right and it's not her kid. I wonder if this happened more often than we're aware, back before DNA evidence and photographs proliferated. Devil's Kettle. It's a waterfall in northern Minnesota where one half of the waterfall falls into a hole in the rocks and is never seen again. Local geologists have thrown stuff down there and nothing is ever seen again. When you consider two types of rocks in the area, it's even more confusing. Weirdly, here in Bulgaria, there is a similar case called the Devil's Throat Cave, where a local river goes through some very dark cave system, but it does flow out of the side of the mountain instead of just disappearing. There was an attempt to map out the cave some years ago where two geologists dove down the cave with scuba suits and oxygen tanks. Their bodies were washed up on the other side several days later. Edit, forgot to mention that this place is where, according to ancient Greek legend, one can enter into the underworld ruled by Hades, and this is where Orpheus entered to save his dead beloved wife. The Valentich disappearance. In the 1970s, a man flying a light plane flying over water from Melbourne, Australia to Tasmania claimed to air traffic that he was being followed. About 20 minutes into the conversation he claims it wasn't an aircraft, that the only sound is a metallic sound. He and the aircraft are still missing, and if you type UFO with Valentich appearance is a pic of a UFO took around the same time in a Melbourne beach. He was a known UFO enthusiast, and his radio traffic as he reported that sighting was very similar to a scene in a certain Spielberg movie, which had come out recently. Very likely he lost his orientation and flew into the sea as he was making his hoax report. I thought the common assumption was he accidentally was flying upside down and the person following him was actually his own reflection. What? If you fly upside down, or even horizontally, with the right amount of curvature to your path, it feels like 1G normal, straight and level flight. So if you get mixed up, perhaps during a turn in the clouds, you can find yourself flying an inverted arc that eventually runs into the ground.